Right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to Anderson House here in Washington, D.C. My name is Andrew Allen, and I'm the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence, fulfilling the aim of the Continental Army officers who founded the Society of the Cincinnati in 1783 to perpetuate the memory of that vast event. In addition to today's lunch bite, the Institute fulfills that aim by supporting advanced study, developing exhibitions and other historical programs and tours, advocating historic preservation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done all of this work from right here at its headquarters, Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark that was completed in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson. Today's lunch bite features the Institute's Deputy Director and Curator, Emily Parsons, discussing a British light Dragoon carbine that was captured by American privateers near Boston Harbor in 1776. Emily joined the professional staff here at Anderson House in 2002, and she currently oversees the Institute's museum programs, including its collections, exhibitions, and public events, along with the interpretation of Anderson House. Additionally, Emily has also co-curated exhibitions at George Washington's Mount Vernon and the Washington Antique Show. And all of this work has fostered her research interests in the history and material culture of the Revolutionary era, as well as the cultural history of Gilded Age America. Now, before I turn things over to Emily, as always, there are a few housekeeping items for those of you tuning with us this afternoon on Zoom. Following today's lunch bite, there will be a question and answer session, so please feel free to submit your questions for Emily using the Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to incorporate them with our live audience questions. Should you have any technical related issues or comments, please submit them using the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that, so they will do their best to assist you at any point. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Emily Parsons.
Thank you, Andrew, and all of you who are here and tuning in. I'm looking forward to sharing with you this firearm from our collections, why it was made, how it was used, and its history during the Revolutionary War, which really gets to, I think, the fascinating journey it took to America and to be part of the history of the Revolution. It's a relatively recent acquisition for us. We acquired it in 2019, purchased from an antiques dealer. So what is a carbine? And for those of you here in person, we have the carbine here in front of me in the flesh, and afterwards you'll be able to come up and view it and take a look more closely. But we have a smooth bore firearm, so the inside of the barrel is not rifled. It's lightweight and shorter than the standard infantry musket that was typically, and this carbine was typically issued to dragoon, light infantry, and artillery troops. So these were men who fought and moved on horseback rather than on foot, or who had a primary role other than fighting in the field, like the artillery troops. These men were issued this horse carbine in addition to usually a pair of pistols, as well as a heavy saber, which accommodated the fact that carbines weren't always issued being able to take a bayonet. So a heavy saber would provide them an edge weapon if they needed it. In the British Army, carbines were first used in 1756, which is the same year that the British Army created light dragoon units. And you'll see in this image here a really wonderfully researched, well done, modern painting of a Revolutionary War period British light dragoon unit. And you can see, particularly the man on horseback is carrying a carbine. And if you're able to look that closely, if you look at the side of on the opposite side of the lock that you're seeing there on the image, on the carbine that he's carrying on horseback, there's this metal bar attached to that side of the carbine that has sort of clasp, attaching it, kind of securing it to him and to the horse as he rides. So this is a great illustration of these men and how these would have been used. Light Dragoon units were trained to fight on horseback, but also specialized in scouting, patrolling, and skirmishing as advanced units. So the carbine we have is, formally speaking, a pattern 1756. So the same year the British Army created light dragoon units, they issued a pattern for a carbine specifically for those troops. So we're looking at here a different example from the Royal Armouries collection in the UK of the standard pattern 1756. So what you're looking at here on the screen is a walnut stocked carbine. And the stock was initially made to fully reach the muzzle, which made them incapable of taking a bayonet. Some, like this one, as well as the one we have, had the forestock cut back a few inches and a stud added to the top of the barrel, which would allow a bayonet to be secured onto the barrel. And especially later on, as this pattern was used in the field and evolved in the British Army, that modification was made. This has a 37-inch long 65 caliber barrel. And since I mentioned this was shorter than the standard infantry musket, that standard infantry musket in the British Army of the same year was 46 inches long compared with a 37 and a 78 caliber barrel. The barrel was pin mounted to the stock, which was the British standard. This one was made in 1761 as marked on the lock plate by Grice, and it has brass furniture, including 3 brass pipes underneath the barrel securing the ramrod. So as I mentioned with the illustration I showed previously, this was originally issued with a long metal sidebar on the left side of the carbine opposite the lock, and this was to secure the weapon while mounted. In some cases, this was removed and then replaced with sling swivels that would have been secured through holes drilled in the bottom of the stock underneath the barrel to allow a leather sling to be fed through and for soldiers to carry it over their shoulder or across their body that way. Another sort of evolution or modification of this weapon. So now if we compare that Royal Armouries example on the top with our pattern 1756 carbine on the bottom, what we have has some similarities, but some differences. First being ours has a cherry stock. It also has its forestock cut back and a bayonet stud added, so it could take a bayonet. It's also about 37 inches long with the barrel, the same 65 caliber. But here you'll see it's mounted to the stock with these very noticeable brass barrel bands, which was the French way of doing this, not the British way. And those barrel bands also then have an accommodation for securing the ramrod underneath. Ours was made just a year later, 1762. The lock plate is marked with the name Edge for the gunsmith Richard Edge. It also has brass furniture. Our example does not have a sidebar on the left side of the musket or of the carbine. You're just seeing a brass side plate. Ours does have holes through the stock for sling swivels, although the swivels themselves, those metal pieces, did not survive. And as you're seeing here on the lock plate, you can see that the date 1762, Edge, the maker's name, and then the British Crown, GR, and other markings that were put on by the Board of Ordnance as this weapon was proofed and authorized for issue. So since I've talked about this weapon being here, present during the American Revolution, how did it get here? So summer of 1775 in Boston, we have Colonel Samuel Cleveland, who was the highest ranking senior British artillery officer in America. He was the commander of the 4th Battalion of Royal Artillery. And he apparently felt a deficiency of firearms in the Boston area. and wrote to London requesting that the Board of Ordnance, which was responsible for supplying the British Army, that they ship 2,000 carbines to Boston. The Board of Ordnance agreed and sent the carbines aboard 2 store ships sailing with a fleet from Cork. These various delays due to weather and other administrative things prevented their departure until early 1776, when the ships and their cargo finally made their way across the Atlantic to Boston. Now, the carbines that the Board of Ordnance decided to send to Cleveland and the other British troops around Boston were almost 2 decades old. There was actually a more modern pattern issued by the Board of Ordnance for British troops that were being issued presently in the early 1770s and as the war got going, to units that they were freshly shipping out to America. But ones already in America were typically going to get the older carbines, the older weapons that were just sort of languishing in storehouses. So what the Board of Ordnance decided to send were remaining pattern 1756 carbines, which were now sort of superseded by more modern, updated patterns. So these ordnance transport ships, the 2 of them, began approaching the American coast in the spring of 1776, when one of them, the Hope, was separated from the convoy in a storm. She appeared off Nantasket Roads, a channel leading into Boston Harbor, and you'll see that at the bottom right of this French chart of Boston Harbor and the environs. So it was May 17th, 1776, and the Hope was captured by an American privateer named the Franklin that was commanded by Captain James Mugford Jr. of Marblehead. James Mugford Jr., unfortunately, would be killed just 2 days later in action with a different British vessel. So these American privateers have captured the Hope and her cargo, which included half of the carbines requested by Colonel Cleveland, so 1,000 of these carbines, along with 4 cannon, almost 1,500 barrels of gunpowder, and numerous additional tools and equipment. So this was a windfall for the Continental Army, which at the time, just a few months into the war, was really struggling for lack of proper martial weapons, and especially well-made, standardized weapons that could be issued in the thousands. So what this produced was intense interest among any high-ranking Continental Army officer or general who caught word of this cache of weapons that had been captured. The same day the Hope was taken, Major General Artemus Ward, who you see here, commander of the Continental Army's Eastern Department, wrote to George Washington reporting on this, quote, very valuable prize laden with provisions and warlike stores meant for the king's troops. And before Washington could have even received Artemus Ward's letter, Ward had gone ahead and divided the captured cargo for storage in Boston, taking it upon himself to put this under the care of the Assistant Quartermaster General, as well as the Continental Deputy Commissioner of Artillery in the city. News of the capture of the Hope would quickly spread through the high ranks of the Continental Army's leadership. Washington's generals and other officers soon began lobbying the commander-in-chief and others to receive the prized arms, which remained so limited in the American troops. So in addition to Ward, we have Henry Knox, who wanted much of the cargo for his Continental artillery and wrote to Washington. Add into the mix Colonel Rufus Putnam, who was soon to be appointed Chief of Engineers at New York, who requested particularly engineering tools and equipment, which admittedly were not high on many other people's lists. The carbines were what people were really fighting over. And lastly, you have Major General Israel Putnam, who was stationed with Washington at headquarters in New York at the time, who was actually seeking similar tools as Rufus Putnam for building fortifications. He wanted axes and shovels, hammers, spikes, and sandbags, among many other supplies that were on the Hope. Additionally, you have a group called the Gentlemen of the Town of Boston, who had just formed an independent corps and heard from Ward and others that these carbines existed and asked that they be issued some of the carbines as they began recruiting for their independent unit. So Washington, not quite a year into his role as commander-in-chief, has this sort of administrative but very important supplying detail to adjudicate, in addition to all of the other concerns of strategy and recruiting and keeping men in the army and in the ranks that he has to deal with as commander-in-chief. So he has Artemas Ward's letter from May 17th, the date that this cargo was taken capture. And before responding to General Ward, Washington felt, even after almost a year as commander-in-chief and with his extensive military experience, he felt that he needed official support from Congress to declare that he was the one, as commander-in-chief, authorized to even decide what was to happen to these carbines and the other cargo, which I think is rather extraordinary for a man in his position who had been through already in those, say, 10 months of the war, what he had, and making the decisions that he had, that he still felt he needed this resolution of Congress, which he did fairly quickly get. Congress did adopt a resolution that the commander-in-chief had authority over all the military stores captured by the Franklin, specifically in this case, but also went beyond that to say any other cargo that would be taken by American privateers anywhere during the war would be the purview of the commander-in-chief to disperse or do with what he felt fit. So May 28th, 1776, so we're 11 days after the Hope was captured, Washington finally wrote back to Artemas Ward, directing that most of the stores be sent immediately to New York rather than remaining in Boston, because the bulk of the Continental Army was in New York, trying to maintain control of that city, and Washington's anticipating correctly that New York would be the next target for the British Army. Washington specifically ordered Ward to forward 800 of the 1,000 carbines, complete with bayonets and cartridge boxes, which were also prized, as well as 400 barrels of gunpowder directly to New York. Washington also authorized Ward to fulfill the requests made by Henry Knox that his artillery get some of the carbines, as well as Rufus Putnam for the equipment. Anything remaining from the cargo was to be stored, quote, in some good and secure place, not to be disposed of till further directions. So Washington was very specific and firm, I think, with Ward. He also insisted that Ward not distribute these carbines to the recruits of the Independent Corps of Boston, except, quote, in case of absolute necessity, such as the appearance of an invasion or the like. So they were really not on the list of eligible units for these. And lastly, Washington specified that the remaining gunpowder specifically be, quote, sent to some place of security in the country, not too contiguous to Boston, there to be kept under a good and trusty guard, till it shall be disposed of, apprehending it imprudent that more should remain in Boston than may be absolutely necessary for fear of accidents. And this goes directly in contrary to what Ward's initial instinct was, to keep all of this in Boston. So we have these very specific directions, but it would end up taking months and maybe even more for the troops in New York to receive Washington's intended carbines and other equipment. And so what we're looking at here is a map of the theater of action to come in New York through the summer and fall of 1776. And so the battles coming at Brooklyn, Kips Bay, Harlem Heights, White Plains, Brooklyn and Fort Washington is really what Washington was foreseeing, and why he so desperately wanted these additional weapons to be given to his troops in New York City. As we know now, this series of engagements did not go well for the Americans and resulted in the Americans leaving New York into the control of the British. So May 28th is when Washington had given these instructions to General Ward. On June 3rd, Ward began sending some of the arms to Washington by way of Norwich, Connecticut. And he put in charge of this transportation Israel Putnam Jr., a captain who was Major General Israel Putnam's son, who was also one of these men who was lobbying for some of these arms. At the end of June, a whole month later, Washington ordered Ward to send the remaining 200 carbines, quote, being in the greatest distress here for arms without the most distant prospect of obtaining a supply. So Washington in New York, more than a month after he gave this initial instruction to General Ward, is still feeling this intense lack of suitable weapons. Some of those carbines began arriving in New York in July and were issued in part to men serving under Brigadier General Thomas Mifflin at Fort Washington. The summer continued to wear on, and as the British threat to New York grew closer, Washington became really exasperated and repeatedly wrote to Artemas Ward, noting the absence of the remaining carbines and urgently looking for news of their arrival. And it wasn't until the end of August that all 1,000 carbines captured from the Hope 3 months earlier would be accounted for in New York. So Washington did in the end get his order and his wish for all of these to make their way to the men in New York. So turning back to our carbine, the British Light Dragoon Carbine in our collections is one of the 1,000 carbines captured from the Hope sent to Continental troops in New York. So how do we know that? And if you can think back to earlier when I compared this to the pattern 1756 that's still in England, we can see alterations that were made once it got to America, particularly the cherry stock, which particularly American wood that you would never have seen on a British weapon otherwise. Why would that have been done? Reportedly, these barrels, which were pin mounted to the stock, which was something the British Army had been doing and would continue to do for generations. Apparently, in this particular application with these carbines, the Americans reported that this was inadequate and that the barrels were coming loose from the stock. And so that was damaging the weapons, perhaps damaging the stocks beyond repair. And so some of them were being turned back in to the Continental Army, which had armorers at workshops in Philadelphia, Lancaster, and Springfield, Massachusetts. And so to correct the gun's flaws, these American armorers were often restocking them in native wood, securing them to the barrel with these French barrel bands, which were sort of a heavier, more kind of pressure mounted, secure way of attaching the barrel to the stock. So the example in our collections was restocked during the war by these Continental armorers. We don't know where exactly, we don't know by who, but can assume because of the native cherry wood that happened. It seems that in addition to adding the French brass barrel bands, that these American armorers also made a new a new ramrod to fit with those barrel bands underneath the barrel. But otherwise, it appears that certainly the lock and the other brass furniture coming off of the original English-made carbine were reused. So the brass side plate, the escutcheon plate on the stock, and the butt plate at the end of the weapon would have come off of that British-made example. So you get, in general, the same profile and a very similar appearance until you really start to look for it closer at some of these details. So even its survival here, and the dealer we bought this from had done research into other surviving examples that would show these American alterations and said he had found maybe 5 others, I think all in private hands, that showed this cherry wood and French barrel bands and other alterations that Americans would have made here during the war. So it's not a unique piece, but it seems very rare as a survival of these very hard used weapons that really, I think, made a difference for arming and protecting the troops so that they had appropriate arms when they went into the field. But it's also, I think, a really wonderful sort of lively story of how the Continental Army went about acquiring, fighting over, deciding how to use, and then ultimately fighting with this important cache of British firearms, which certainly wouldn't be the first or last time that captured weapons would make an important part of what was issued to American troops during the war. So that's what I have for you this afternoon, and would be happy to take questions before we let those of you here in person come up and take a look at this more closely. Yeah.
Why did it take so long for the weapons to get to Washington? Was it just they didn't have the means to do it, logistically, or people were still fighting over it, or what?
So the question is, why did it take so long after Washington ordered Ward to get the weapons to New York for that to actually happen? I don't know if Ward was dragging his feet at all, because he had hoped that these would stay, I think, in the Boston area. He was from Massachusetts, and I think probably knew a lot of the soldiers in the Boston area who could be the recipients of these, and maybe he drug his feet a little bit. Certainly, actually physically transporting these weapons safely through, areas where you still had a heavy, even if not British Army presence in places, Loyalist presence. I mean, there were formally organized and armed Loyalist units, particularly in Westchester County. So is sort of the path you would be taking from Massachusetts and Connecticut down to New York. That was almost no man's land because it was so contested and hard to get through. So there were, I think, a lot of legitimate logistical details to work out, but it is a little bit of a head scratcher how that took so long. What route? Good question. I actually don't know that, except for the note that we have that Artemis Ward said that they went from Boston to, was it Norwich, Connecticut? And then from there on to New York. But I don't know. That'd be worth looking into.
Presumed by ship or by land?
By land, is my presumption. Yeah, I think that's what I would presume. Yes.
So the privateer that took the hope, what's in it for them? How does that work?
So the question, a good question is, what's the privateer who captured the Hope? What's in it for them, for these privateers? I think in a lot of cases they were able to keep some of the cargo that they captured. That was presumably not the case here, because these were so sought after. Whether they were paid by the Continental Army in exchange for the stores could also have been the case.
But that was at the time, sort of our Navy. I mean, basically a private Navy.
In part, and especially, so this is May of 1776. We're still fairly early on. There was a very kind of infant American Navy forming, but privateers was what we relied on early on, especially, and would continue to do so throughout the war. So I think that kind of monetary prize in exchange for what they captured is what their motivation was.
And did I miss how you said this was found in Boston, right? In this, when it was collected by, or maybe it was just part of it came from Boston as part of the original story.
Right.
It wasn't like pulled out of like a swamp in Boston after a battle.
Sure. So more of the provenance of our carbine specifically, I don't know, unfortunately, all that far back. The dealer we bought it from had acquired it from another dealer collector who had it for several decades. And I don't know farther back from that where he may have gotten it. Certainly, we don't have any information about a specific soldier who may have carried this during the war and kept it. A lot of times you do end up with weapons like that coming down in American families from soldiers who took their weapon home with them. Even if they weren't supposed to, if it was formally issued by the Army, in theory, it should have been returned to the Army, but that often didn't happen. Or whether it was some sort of, archaeological find in a field somewhere. I would suspect, that the stock itself is in good condition. So I would suspect that's not the case, but we really don't know. How much does it weigh? So the pattern 1756 typically weighed a little over 6 pounds. So it was much lighter as well than the typical Brown Bess infantry musket. How much would the Brown Bess musket have weighed? So it's somewhere around 10, 11 pounds. So almost half what the infantry troops. So this is who owns it now. This is part of our museum collections here. So the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati is who purchased this in 2019. And so our museum collections that we maintain here and put on exhibition emphasize the Revolutionary War itself. Who fought it? How did they do so? How was the war commemorated? What is its legacy? So our collections and armaments from the war period itself are one of our particular interests and strengths. We don't, how much did it cost? We don't comment on how much we pay, how much things may be worth. And certainly to us, these kinds of things are invaluable for their survival from 200 plus years ago and what they can tell us about how this war was fought and the people who did it.
So the to use this black powder, it's got a musket ball. You said the diameter was what?
It's a 65 caliber.
65 caliber. I have no idea of what that process would be on horseback. Would you? Is that I mean, obviously they're trained to do this, and you have to reload. You only have one shot, right? So I mean, is that? I mean, everybody was kind of playing on an even playing field because nobody had a revolver at the time. So it would be pretty challenging, I would imagine, and maybe that's why the shorter gun stock has to be more nimble.
Right. Right. On horseback, it does, it being lighter, more maneuverable is important. I'm not as familiar with cavalry and other mounted troops and how they work. So actually one of my colleagues may be able to step in, but I don't think that this actually was the primary weapon of those issued to mounted troops that they would go to first.
Right.
Their pistols, their sword would certainly be easier to manage while they were on horseback. But otherwise, I think the process of loading and firing this weapon is just the same as it would have been for the infantry troops carrying Brown Bess muskets, where you've got, hopefully you have preformed cartridges rather than dealing with individual measured amounts of black powder and then an individual musket ball. And if you've got, and I think there was a reference to cartridge boxes actually already coming over from Britain with this shipment. So if you have cartridge boxes, you've got hopefully paper cartridges already filled with, one musket ball and the pre-measured amount of black powder that you need. So that goes down the barrel with, I think, some of the paper as wadding, and that all gets rammed down with the ramrod. You've got a little bit of black powder that you put through the touch hole that's in the lock to start the sort of ignition and reaction in the barrel to propel the musket ball. But I think that process is going to work the same on horseback, but I imagine it to be a sort of more cumbersome process than when you're on foot. Any other questions, especially from our Zoom audience?
Start with a very general question. What is the origin of the term dragoon?
What is the origin of the term dragoon? So earlier when I said I am not as well versed in cavalry and mounted troops, I'm going to defer to my colleague, Paul Newman, who's our museum collections manager, to answer that question.
I mean, or she could repeat it or whatever you want to do. Yeah, sure. Is the mic up? Yeah. Yeah.
I turn over the stage to Paul Newman.
Hello. I'm glad you asked. So I have to put a different hat on than I get to a lot of the. Oh, sorry. I'm trying to wear my other hat that I used to wear when I was a curator of a cavalry museum. So and if I get it wrong, the British Army will come for me. So there's kind of two thoughts with Dragoon. One was that it's coming from the word dragon, which maybe sounds farcical, but that's one school of thought, that it's coming from dragon. And it was the idea that as these men were riding along and they were using black powder weapons, so you're getting that puff of black powder in the air. It was reminiscent of that. And that's one. There is another one. I'm struggling to think of it off the top of my head. Then if you something to kind of where you hear dragoon in modern parlance, if you ever hear to dragoon somebody, it comes from the idea that the dragoons were posted into villages and towns, which was kind of commonplace in European armies before 19th century, contrary that's often talked about in here. But is the idea that you were forcibly making people do something against their will, and especially going into a housing situation. So it only partly answers the question. I'm trying to remember the other bit. Maybe I'll think of it later, but that's one of the main ways that dragoon kind of comes about. Yeah.
Do we have anything else?
Oh, yeah, we've got a lot of questions.
All right. Do I know if reproductions are made of this? Yes. In fact, as you, if you were to Google pattern 1756 British light dragoon carbine, that is often the first thing that comes up, are reproductions made for reenactors or other collectors. And it is, I found that it was actually difficult to find an original pattern 1756 coming up in, other museum collections or elsewhere. So whether it's the example like the Royal Armories has, or like our American altered version, the originals seem to be quite scarce, but you can buy a reproduction. Back to Zoom. Good.
Accurate was carbine compared with the shorter barrel compared to a brown bess? Maybe in terms of if you want to go for yardage or anything like that.
How accurate was a carbine with the shorter barrel compared to the longer brown bess? And of course, both of them are smooth bores, so they are kind of challenged by that, not having rifling that would come in other cases. I imagine they would be less accurate owing to the, what we have about 9-inch or math, about 9-inch shorter barrel. So I imagine they are a bit less accurate. You're also riding on horseback. So if you're moving, an additional challenge, I think, to accuracy.
We have somebody with a few people with very good eyes. What are the initials AK?
Ah, good. Yes, which I did not mention. What are the initials AK on the stock? We can't really tell when those initials were, we presume they're someone's initials. We can't really tell when they were carved. They are old. I would say I'd be a little skeptical if they were original to the period of the Revolution. It is something that you see from time to time on the butt of a musket or a rifle. So it seemed to be something that people did to some extent is carve initials into that part of their firearm. I think our, if pushed to say, our presumption is that it's later than the period of the Revolution, but we don't really know for sure. And we have no other information to go along with the history of this piece to know who in the world AK may be. But that is good eyes.
And do we have any idea of which particular regiments or units got these captured guns?
Oh, do we know which units got these captured guns on the American side? There was a specific reference in Washington and Ward's correspondence that General Mifflin at Fort Washington received some of the carbines in New York. Otherwise, I had not run across specific references to them. It would be interesting to go through, muster rolls or other documentation from the individual units that were with the Army in New York at that time to see, who was recording having what equipment, but I hadn't gotten into those details yet.
Policy question. Was it required for weapons like these to be turned in after a time of service is up, for example?
So question is, was it required for weapons like these to be turned in when their service was over? And when you say weapons like these, since this was formally, it was a property of the Continental Army formally issued by the Army to troops, then technically, yes, I believe these were supposed to be turned back into the Army when you left. But as I said before, that often didn't happen. Even if you make it all the way to summer or even fall of 1783 and kind of mustered out at Newburgh or elsewhere along the Hudson or in the South, wherever you might be, in those large numbers and very formal encampments, even then you have a lot of people who just take their Army issued weapon home, because we have seen a lot of them that descend in the family of a soldier. So there's a lot of evidence that these did go home, even if technically they weren't supposed to.
Besides the private owners that you mentioned, are there any examples of any other institutions?
Are there any examples of this in other institutions, of the specific American captured ones? I'm not aware of any other in an institutional collection. The dealer who we bought this from has done a lot of research into this area, and he had identified a handful of others that were known to exist at all. And I think those are all in private hands. So, all right.
Just to make the AK, was that an anti-theft thing that people did to, say this is my weapon, even if they acquired it later on in the 1800s, whatever. Is that why the AK was put on?
So a question of why someone would put their initials on the weapon, and particularly was that an anti-theft measure? It could have been, or if not anti-theft, to just identify, this is my weapon. There may be hundreds of these floating around the same camp or dozens in the same unit, owned by other soldiers, but this one's mine. It could also have been, after you take this home, or in a later generation of the family, someone just recording kind of their ownership of it, or their family's ownership of it, or their ancestors' use of it on the butt. But I think we generally assume that someone who carried the weapon would have done that. But exactly when, we don't know. All right, I think that wraps up our lively question session. Thank you all for that, and for tuning in and for coming. And I would invite everyone who's here in person to come up, and you can take a look more closely at this from all sides. So thank you again.